Hello, this is Jim Pellegrino, your host for the hour, and for our next segment we have one of our favorite guests, Larry Cafero. Larry,
how are you,
welcome
Jim?
back to the show.
Pleasure to be back.
Larry is the Connecticut General Assembly Minority Leader. He's in his 4th term, previously Deputy Leader for 6 terms, and also a resident of Norwalk. I think it's the 142nd district,
right.
Larry, right?
That's right.
So, Larry, here we are.
Here we are,
Larry. The last time you were on the show, we were heading into trouble, according to you, because we had just raised taxes $1.5 billion, and the forecast was very, very rosy for what was going to happen over the next couple of years. And you raised your hand with kind of a contrary opinion and said, this just really ain't going to happen. Well, here we are. It's a little while later, and according to what I have read, what was forecast was about a $300 to $400 billion deficit this year, and we can talk a little bit about that, about how you've mitigated against that. And then over the next 2 years, because you're doing a biennial budget, there is a $2.5 billion in real and projected red ink before you go home this June. So let's divide it in two.
Think about what you just said, Jim. Think about what you just said.
After
a $1.5 billion tax increase.
Highest in Connecticut history.
Ever. Then we were told, if we swallowed that tough medicine, everything will be on stable ground.
As a matter of fact, Larry,
we will have 5 years at least of surpluses.
As a matter of fact, Larry, the prediction was $226 million surplus in 13-14 and $942 million surplus in 14-15. And here we are, 1 year later, 2 years later. What happened?
Well, first of all, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out what happens. When you have a deficit the type of which that we had, and the way you solve that deficit, we were told by the governor that he would solve it with three-prong approach. One, he said he was going to cut spending.
Right.
2, he said he was going to get very serious concessions from the state employees.
Right.
And 3, he said, as a last resort, his words, not mine, I'll raise taxes. And here's what happened. He didn't cut spending a nickel. Not a nickel. In fact, we spent $1.3 billion more than we had spent in the previous year. Number 2, the concessions he claimed to have achieved with the state employee unions, which he claimed amounted to $1.6 billion over 2 years, he was unable to document half of that, at least half of that. So there's about $800 million that we didn't see. And lastly, therefore, if the only thing you do to solve a budget problem is to increase taxes, it never works. It never works. And what happened is that the revenue we expected to get from this tax increase didn't come in.
Right.
The spending cuts he claimed he would do never materialized. In fact, we spent more. And the savings he said he would get, he didn't get even half of that. You put those 3 things together,
and there we are.
It doesn't take a brain surgeon to know you're going to be in deficit. And that's what we are. In fact, we weren't even into the budget he had passed and acclaimed. We weren't into it 2 months before we started to run into red ink. And we ended the year $150 million, the first year of the 2-year budget, $150 million worth in deficit. And to pay for it, because we have to have a balanced budget, we took money that was slated to pay off long-term debt and
moved it in.
And we moved. So we took borrowed money, if you will, and we paid to just balance our budget.
Okay, that was in
2012.
Right.
Then this fiscal year, which started July 1st, we weren't in it 3 months. We started to see 10 million, 20 million, 30 million in deficit. The governor kept saying it's just a blip, it's a road bump, no big deal. Cafero and others are saying the sky is falling. I kept saying, let's be careful. We're going in the wrong direction. Sure enough, right up to the election, before the election, he claimed no big deal, this is not a problem. Right after the election, we found out that our deficit was $325 million, and then 4 days later went up to $450 million.
As a matter of fact, Kevin Lembo, who's the controller, he's the one that kept on blowing the whistle, wasn't he, Larry?
Right. Right.
Kevin kept on saying, this thing is worse than you think it is.
Well, he said it, he would say it, but we kept saying it because we were checking with the nonpartisan Office of Fiscal Analysis, and they kept saying, I don't know where the governor's coming up with these figures, but we're in deep trouble here. Deep trouble. And as a matter of fact, even after the deficit mitigation exercise we did on December 19th, and we could talk about that in a bit, the comptroller just came out 2 days ago and said, nice try, fellas, we're still $40 million in the hole.
Yeah, I saw that.
And that's going to grow.
I saw that.
That's going to grow.
So what was the principal reason you were given why the revenue stream didn't materialize as we expected it to?
Well, first of all, you made it, you know, there's this theory that, you know, if you increase taxes, you'll get increased revenue. Well, at some point, there's a tipping point.
There is a tipping point.
If you increase taxes on cigarettes, on booze, on
anything you can't
and
nail
anything
down.
you can't, if people could buy the product cheaper elsewhere, they're going to do that. And if you drive them to do that by making the cost of that item so high through taxation, they're going to buy it elsewhere. They're going to buy their cigarettes off the internet or take a trip down to South Carolina. They're going to buy their booze in New Hampshire. They're going to get their gas in New Jersey. And we see that every single revenue category is less than we expected to have. They've fallen off. Sales tax has fallen off. Casino revenue's fallen off. Income tax is lower than expected. Corporate tax is lower than expected.
But that income tax thing, Larry, for example, I mean, given the unemployment situation in Connecticut, that has to be exacerbating the lack of revenue collection. In other words, if I'm not working, I ain't paying income tax.
Well, absolutely. But you don't even have to go that far, Jim. Let's assume you were one of these 1%ers, right?
Yeah.
You made $2 million a year. You were fat and happy.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? You might still be doing fine. But you're not making 2. Maybe you're making 1. Now, I'm not going to cry over a guy making $1 million a year. But do the math. The income tax on $2 million is a lot more than it is on $1 million. And we had a whole recession here where people were making less than they had made.
And it's also true in your neck of the woods down there, Larry, in Fairfield County, where a lot of people are fairly well off. They're the people that keep on getting beaten up. The class warfare thing. Of
course.
Right? I mean, you beat up on these people and beat up on these people and beat up on these people, and you don't tell the rest of the people that these people, this 20% of the population, is contributing 60% of the revenue stream.
Forgive me, 2%.
2%.
The top 2% of the taxpayers are pulling 52% of the weight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, you keep beating on that 2%, they're going to leave. Now it's 1% pulling that wagon.
Exactly.
And the problem we have is when you rely, excuse me, on 2% of the taxpayers to pull that amount of weight. Picture them pulling this heavy carrot. If they stumble on a rock, if they trip and fall, if there's a blip on Wall Street, forget about it.
It's interesting, though, Larry, I mean, this is a general comment, how even at the federal election level, politically, in raw political terms, how well that plays, doesn't it? Let's tax the rich to get them to pay their fair share. And it turns out like in the federal election, right? Somebody stood up and said one day, you can tax them all you want. It'll pay for 25 days in the whole year.
That's right.
What, are you crazy?
That's right.
So,
but it sells great. You know, if you're
that's
talking
what
to
I'm
a bunch
saying.
of people who are hurting, and we all are in this economy, and say, you know what the problem is? Those rich guys, tax them.
Yeah.
That's easy to jump out.
Marie Antoinette said, Larry, let them eat cake.
Yeah, that's easy to
So, Larry, here we are.
But it doesn't solve a problem.
It's June of this year. We're now in 2013. It's June of this year. You guys, I mean, according to what I read, right, $2.5 billion in real and projected red ink.
Over 2 years.
Over 2 years, right? And early in 2012, the administration said we could look forward to surpluses totaling $1.1 billion over the same 2-year period. That's actually a $3 billion shift. Right. So there you are, Cafero and his boys, and the Democrats and their boys and girls, and they're sitting there in June of this year, after he submits the budget in February, right? Where are you going to come up with $2 billion over the next 2 years?
Well, I'll tell you where we're not going to come up with it, because the governor, by his actions, took that off the table.
You mean no layoffs?
We can't lay off a single person. Not a single person can we lay off for 2 years. Now, they will say, well, hey, that was the deal you made. And in fairness to state employees, that is the deal they made.
The deal's a deal.
The deal they made. But let's talk about the deal that the governor negotiated. He said, I won't lay you off for 4 years. In fact, after year 2, you could start getting raises again, guaranteed for 3 more years. I'm going to extend your pension and health care benefits for another 5 years to the year 2022. Okay? And here's what you got to give me. You got to give me some real concessions. People, if they didn't retire by a certain date, then when they retired in the future, that would be penalized, and that forced a lot of people to retire. That saves some money. They said we're going to have $180 million that employees are going to make in suggestions.
I remember that.
Zero.
I remember
Jim,
that.
Zero. $150 million employees and the government are going to get together and make technology savings. Zero. Nothing. So a lot of those savings never materialize. So when you look at the quid pro quo, did the state employees get 4 years guaranteed? Yes. Are they going to get 3 years of raises? Yes. Is their pensions and health care extended for 5 years? Yes. Did the state save $1.6 billion? No.
No.
You tell me how good a deal that was.
And that's easily answered too, Larry, isn't it? I mean, if you call for, and I know that you have, but if you or anybody else calls for the documentation of the purported savings, have they been able to produce it?
You know how many times I called for the savings?
And what have you gotten?
We don't have to answer that. Our consultants and actuaries all agree on these numbers. May I see how they did it? You know, trust, but verify.
Yeah.
I can't show you. So yet we took it to our nonpartisan Office of Fiscal Analysis, and they said, we've gone over this 100 times. We can't come up with even $800,000 worth of savings.
So is what you, Larry, tell me this is not true, is what it is you just told me. I mean, because labor has got to represent probably 40 to 50% of the budget, right? You got a third of the budget is probably Medicaid or something, right? So it's probably
$5 billion.
It's probably 40% of the budget or a number in that area. So you take that off the table and you've lost a lot of leverage. You still got to come up with $2 billion. What we're leaning toward in this conversation, if there's no easily accessible labor savings through layoffs or anything else, and there's no easily accessible other non-discretionary spending over there, where are you going to get this money from? You're going to raise my taxes again?
Or you're
going to borrow it again?
We can't do either of those. If we borrow anymore, our bond rating that's already been cut will go even worse. You raise taxes, I don't know who you're going to raise them on and how much you're going to raise them. Although, believe it or not, many of my good friends on the other side of the aisle are saying raise taxes on the rich. Again, that, you know, let them pay their fair share. You know, I don't know how you do that, and if you do, how long they'll even be here to pay whatever they're paying now, let alone the new, quote, fair share. And then you have serious cuts. And you know what the cruelest thing is, Jim? And I said this at the negotiation table. You know, we were talking about various cuts, and I got to tell you something. You know, despite the stereotypes, Republicans don't relish cuts. Every cut in a line item hurts a person. And somebody said, well, gee, if you do that, aren't you being cruel? I said, you know what's cruel? You know what's really cruel? When you promise somebody something, and you promise them something, but because of your irresponsibility, you can't afford it, and then you got to take it away from them. That's the cruelest thing. I said to somebody, picture you promise your kid that he could go to his favorite college, Boston College, and he gets in and he gets enrolled at Central Connecticut University.
Absolutely. Okay.
And you're paying that tuition, and he's loving it, and you know whatever. And then because you gambled away the tuition money,
right,
at one of the casinos, you got to come back and say, "Hey, son, sorry." I have no more money. I got to pull you out. That's the cruelest thing you could do. And that's what we're doing.
Our budget, Larry, is about $20 billion now, right?
Over $20 billion.
Over $20 billion.
That's right.
So if we did some quick math, 10% gets you $2 billion, 5% gets you $1 billion. So you got to go into that budget. You got to go into the operating budget and get 5% each year in order to get $1 billion a year. Now, that 5% cut, I mean, to the average person is almost like a no-brainer. But, I mean, you've been...
Well, there's certain things you can't cut. So of that $20 billion we just talked about, employee salaries, take that off the table. There's certain things in Medicaid, you know, we get reimbursed from the federal government. Can't touch that. Can't touch that. So you start eliminating those things that you can't touch without penalizing yourself more.
So what's left are draconian cuts for a small piece of the budget.
Exactly.
So you're telling me we're going to get taxes raised again?
Well, I hope to God not over my dead body. I'll do everything in my power, because we just can't do that anymore, because look, it's a vicious cycle, Jim. That's why our unemployment is 9%. There are no companies that want to come in here and do business because they're tired of the irresponsibility of the state of Connecticut's fiscal policies that forces us every 2 years to say, I know we told you we weren't going to tax you, but we got to tax you a couple of more years at a couple of more percent. Businesses are tired of looking over their shoulder. And I'm not talking about big mammoth companies. 73% of the businesses in the state of Connecticut have 9 or less employees. Yeah. We are a state of small business. Mm-hmm. And you go talk to these small businessmen and women, some of them who have family businesses for generations. They're holding on by their fingernails. And if it's just yet one more tax, unemployment goes up, workers' comp goes up, your personal income tax goes up, because many of those small companies don't pay a corporate tax. They pay their taxes through personal income tax. So when you raise the personal income tax rate, that's a tax on their business. That's why we've lost 18,000 businesses. That's why we have a 9% unemployment.
Well, actually, Larry, what could happen to you is you could happen like with a compounded felony. And what I mean by that is this whole fiscal cliff thing that's happening in the federal government and the sequestration, where there are massive hits to the defense industry, right? Now, they're not going to let massive hits happen. But there may be hits to the defense industry, because sooner or later the boys and girls in Washington, they got to cut like you have to cut, right? We are heavily dependent on defense and aerospace in the state of Connecticut. Right. And if that segment of the budget gets hit at the federal level, it's going to flow down right here to the state of Connecticut. United Technologies, Electric Boat, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to wind up with a compounded felony, what we're doing to ourselves and what they're going to do to us.
But we have to do something dramatic, Jim. This is something that's so simple, and yet is so difficult to do. We talk about this $2.5 billion deficit in real...
Yeah.
What that means is current services. What it says is if we take what we currently provide as a state and project it out to the next 2 years based on inflation, based on contracts and increases, et cetera, we are going to spend a certain amount of money, and we're only taking in a certain amount of money, and therefore we have a $2.5 billion deficit. But think about this fact. If we spent next year not a nickel less, but not a nickel more than we spent this year, we wouldn't have a deficit. In fact, we'd have a surplus. So if somebody said to you privately in your home, your household budget or your business budget, Jim, last year you spent $20,000. You want to spend next year $25,000. But if you do that, you're going to be $2,500 in the hole. So just stick to your $20,000 budget. You'd say, well, that makes sense. If the state could do that, we'd be in surplus.
Yeah, but that goes back to what you said before, Larry. That difference between that $20,000 and that $25,000 may be commitments that the state of Connecticut has made, like contractual obligations and other things that they can't, quote-unquote, do anything about because they boxed themselves in.
That could be true, but we also have a statute that allows an emergency situations where the state of Connecticut, and frankly it does it many times, although it's selective of where it does it, breaks contracts. If you can't pay, you can't pay. On an individual...
It's like a city going into bankruptcy and you negotiate.
Exactly. So those are really historic and dramatic kind of measures. But I got news for you, Jim. We have to do something. We're going on... If I was here every year at this time of year, for the last 6 years, you and I would be having the same conversation.
I know.
There hasn't been one time where I say, well, Larry, welcome back to the show. Isn't the economy doing great? And we're optimistic to hear that we've created some new jobs and businesses are flourishing. When's the last time you heard me or anyone else say that?
It's a relatively simple equation, Larry, that's hard to implement, isn't it? You can't spend more than you take in.
This is very simple. We learned it at the kitchen table.
It's really like 99A is what it is.
You can't
so here we are. We got 1 minute left. I'm Governor Malloy.
How are you, Governor?
I'm fine.
Where the heck have you been?
I'm fine. Glad to have you in my office again, Larry. You got 45 seconds. I want the 2 or 3 suggestions that you have that can help me through this mess that we've got on our hands. What would those 2 or 3 suggestions be?
In general, we got to cut spending.
Seconds.
We got to cut spending, and we can't look to taxation. And don't dare borrow, Governor. Don't dare borrow.
Okay.
When it comes to making those tough decisions on the cuts, we got to take some bold and courageous action. If you can't do that alone, let's do it in a bipartisan way. Yeah, we'll all have our fingerprints on it. And by the way, there's a lot of people in my party, Jim, breaking roll for a second, who say, Cafero, why are you even sitting down at the table?
Right.
This is their problem.
In, yeah.
This is their problem. Guess what? It's our problem. Because last I checked, I live in the state of Connecticut. I took an oath under God to obey the Constitution, which requires a balanced budget. Even though I didn't start the fire, it's my responsibility.
So, Larry, we got about 15 seconds left. You have to. He submits a budget to you when?
February.
And you have to have it done by
June 30th at the latest.
By June.
Excuse me, not June 30th. First Wednesday in June.
And that's when we'll know.
Well, that's when we'll know. But you know what's happened in the past, because agreement can't be reached. We go into a special session.
By the way, I do want you to know that we went out of our way to invite some of your Democratic colleagues.
They didn't come?
They did not come.
How do you like that?
It was either you or me or both was the reason for it. We'll have to have you back.
I hope so, Jim.
Happy New Year, my friend.
Happy New Year. We'll see you.
And we'll be back